Welcome to the battlefield where the earth itself tried to swallow the living. Passchendaele, 1917. The mud capital of death. Here men drowned standing up, rifles vanished in sludge, and entire platoons were erased between sunrise and sunset. But beneath one shattered ridge 6 feet underground, 7 soldiers clung to a miracle no one believed possible. For 30 hours, German guns poured 9,000 shells into the same patch of earth, tearing timber, crushing trenches, turning air into liquid fire. And when the barrage finally died, silence fell like judgment. No one expected survivors, not a single heartbeat. But then from under the smoking ruin came a faint sound, a tap, then another. 7 men. Alive. Their dugout had become a coffin, flooded, gas-filled, half-collapsed. They scraped the walls for air, drank muddy water, whispered prayers that vanished in the dark. And yet when rescuers broke through the wreckage, lamps shaking in their hands, they saw faces blackened by soot, eyes wide with disbelief, breathing. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this. Because once under 9,000 shells and 6 feet of earth, 7 men defied the arithmetic of war and taught the world what survival really means. October 1917. Flanders lay drowning beneath its own rain, a gray sea of mud and wire, a place where the air itself seemed to rot. The trenches had collapsed into watery graves, duckboards floating like driftwood. Rifles, half-buried boots, lost to suction. The sky pressed low, a lid over a boiling world, and the wind carried the stench of decay and powder. Nothing moved without leaving part of itself behind. Every man who walked here left a footprint that filled with water before he could take the next step. Passchendaele Ridge. The name sounded like a promise on paper. But in truth it was just another scar in the earth. A shallow rise carved by artillery, drowned by rain. The maps called it strategic ground, but those who climbed it called it something else, the edge of hell. Each hour brought new orders to hold, to dig, to endure. Yet nothing could be held in that place. The land itself fought back. The mud swallowed shovels, guns, men, whole platoons vanishing without a trace. It was said the dead floated closer to the living than their own shadows. The 3rd Australian Division took over the line near Zonnebeke, a handful of exhausted men replacing ghosts. They came in silence, guided by the dim glow of cigarette ends and the whisper of boots in sludge. The rain had blurred the boundary between night and day. The world was monochrome, gray upon gray upon gray. Helmets glistened under the flicker of distant explosions. The only color left was the dull brass of shell casings, and the red that seeped quietly into the soil. The men knew this ground by sound, not by sight. The squelch beneath the foot, the hiss of rain on wire, the low hum of the next shell drawing breath. They found an old dugout 6 feet deep, timber-framed, already sagging under its own weight. Engineers called it temporary shelter, but nothing in Passchendaele was temporary except life. 7 men entered it at dusk. 7 strangers turned comrades by the same thin order hold until relieved. The space smelled of oil, mud, and smoke. Their breath fogged in the lantern light. Outside, the guns murmured slow, deliberate, like a storm rehearsing its rage. One man joked it sounded far away. The others didn't answer. They had learned that distance meant nothing when fire could cross a mile in seconds. The first shells came at dawn, a soft thump, then a roar that made the earth tremble. The second hit closer, the dugout shook, dust falling from the roof like dry rain. Then came the pattern, fast, precise, relentless, a rhythm too exact to be chaos. 9,000 shells were marked for this sector, enough to erase the ridge 3 times over. The barrage rolled in waves, each one heavier than the last. The men above ground vanished into smoke and mud. The men below listened, counting seconds between explosions, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. After the first hour, there were no more words, only the dull animal sound of breathing. Outside, the world dissolved. Trenches flattened craters filled with boiling water, trees reduced to splinters. Rain hissed on hot metal. Mud steamed. The air itself burned a thick vapor of gas smoke and vaporized soil. The noise was not heard, but felt a vibration that lived in the chest and never left. One soldier would later write, "The earth was alive. It rose and fell. It swallowed everything that stood." He was right. Even the sky seemed to collapse under the weight of so much fire. Inside the dugout, 7 hearts beat in unison. The roof groaned with each impact, a sound halfway between pain and defiance. They pressed their backs against the mud walls, hands over helmets, eyes fixed on nothing. One lantern flickered shadows, trembling across faces that no longer looked human. Water seeped through cracks in the wall, slow at first, then steady. The youngest tried to scoop it out with his helmet, laughing between coughs. The sergeant told him to save his strength. No one spoke again for hours. The darkness had weight now. It sat on their chests, heavy as the silence between shells. Above them, the German observers watched the ridge through periscopes, adjusting range, correcting aim. The coordinates shrank with every report. The fire tightened like a noose. The ridge was disappearing yard by yard. A runner tried to reach the forward dugouts. He vanished into the mist halfway across. Engineers in the rear wrote one line in their logbook: "Position lost." And yet beneath that ruined grid square, 7 men were still breathing. Night came, but the sky never turned black. It glowed orange clouds lit from beneath by constant fire. Rain mixed with ash falling like soft sparks. The guns pounded on 30 hours without pause. Men spoke of hearing voices in the wind, the echo of those already gone. The sound was everywhere, layered and endless. Even when a shell paused, the air kept screaming. Time stretched thin, measured not in minutes, but in detonations. The ridge shook. The dugout sank. The world above them ceased to exist. At some hour past midnight, the barrage began to slow. The gaps between impacts grew longer, uncertain, hesitant, as if the guns themselves were tiring. The men in the dugout listened to the pauses with dread. Silence felt more dangerous than noise. Then came the collapse. A beam split. The ceiling sagged, and half the chamber filled with mud. One man screamed, another coughed until he couldn't. The lantern went out. Darkness returned, absolute, suffocating, complete. They felt for each other's hands in the dark, gripping hard, holding what little was left of the world. When the final shells stopped, the air was strange, still trembling, but quiet. The ridge above them steamed. Rain hissed against the ruins. No one moved for minutes or hours, no one could tell. Then somewhere deep in the dark, a faint sound began. A knocking, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Not from above, but from inside. One of them tapping with a rifle butt against the wall, a signal to the living that they had not yet joined the dead. At dawn, rescuers from the 3rd Division crawled over the shattered ridge. The ground was no longer ground. It was a slurry of corpses and timber. Every step sank to the knee. They moved by memory, not by map. The landmarks were gone, the wires melted, the trenches erased. A faint tapping reached their ears, once, twice, then silence. They dug with shovels, then with hands, the mud thick and hot. The smell was unbearable, smoke rained flesh. Steam rose from the earth, as if the soil itself exhaled. It took hours to find the entrance, a splintered beam, a patch of air that smelled wrong. They tore it open. A rush of foul, warm breath escaped, carrying the stench of 30 hours trapped underground. The first light revealed faces, gray, hollow, wide-eyed. 7 men alive. One blinked against the brightness, another smiled through cracked lips. They had no words left. The rescuers stared in silence. For a moment, everything stopped, Rain whined thought. The ridge, for the first time in days, stood still, and somewhere in that impossible quiet, it was said that even the guns hesitated, as if unwilling to disturb the miracle beneath their own ruin. The records are still there, written in ink that bled through the paper after the rain. The handwriting uneven, the sentences cut short by thunder. The 3rd Australian Division's War Diary from October 1917 lists the position simply as Sector D11, Zonabeki Ridge. No mention of names, no description of survivors. Just coordinates, times, and the arithmetic of destruction. The entry begins, German artillery commenced concentrated barrage at 05:57, intensity sustained. 9,000 shells. The number wasn't poetic. It came from the report of the German 4th Battery 3rd Bavarian Field Artillery Regiment. Their logbook noting 9 .2 rounds, expended over a grid barely 300 yards wide. They fired in 3 phases: observation fire, rolling barrage, and saturation. Each phase designed not to kill soldiers but to erase ground itself. The soil at Passchendaele had turned so soft that shells didn't explode on impact. They burrowed in, detonating beneath the surface, each blast sending a wave of liquid earth through the trenches like an underwater quake. That was the nature of the Western Front in its 3rd year war as geology. The line between weather and weapon no longer existed. The rain worked for the artillery, magnifying every concussion, turning shock waves into drowning tides. One British observer wrote, "We do not fight the Germans here. We fight the elements they have chosen to command." The dugouts, those narrow coffins of timber and clay, were both refuge and trap. Built 6 to 10 feet deep, lined with railway sleepers and corrugated iron, they were meant to withstand a few hours of shelling, not 30. When a direct hit struck above the pressure wave, forced the air downward, collapsing the roof, crushing lungs before walls even broke. Survival depended on distance, density, and chance, 3 factors no man could calculate in a storm of metal. In the archives at Kew, a fragment of field report survives, a single torn page signed Lieutenant H. Markham. It reads, "We reinforced beams with duckboards from trench wall. Ceiling creaked but held. 7 men inside. Could hear shells above like waves breaking in a cave. No communication with surface. No air movement. Lantern out." The handwriting stops there. The rest of the page is blank except for a water stain that resembles the shape of a fingerprint. By mid-October, the 3rd Division had suffered over 12,000 casualties. Mud swallowed guns. Artillery had to be dragged by 50-man teams, each step sinking deeper into the ground. The German positions across the ridge remained intact, concrete pillboxes embedded like teeth into the slope. Their gunners fired in perfect sequence, one battery relaying corrections to the next. It wasn't hatred that drove them, it was precision. For every 30 shells fired, 1 man might die. The ratio was absurd, but the rhythm never changed. Each 77mm shell carried a timed fuse. German engineers had refined it to detonate at fractions of a second after contact. They called it Boden explosion, the ground burst. The British called it simply the shudder. Men felt it in their bones. It was said the concussion could stop a heartbeat before the mind even registered fear. Somewhere in those 30 hours, a messenger from the rear wrote a short signal, "Weshtu." Unresponsive, presumed destroyed. It was transmitted at 22:40 October 13. No follow-up was ever logged. For military bureaucracy, the event was already complete. The 7 men in the dugout no longer existed on paper, but the human world continued beneath the numbers. The miners among them, men used to the silence of the earth, would have understood what came next. Each explosion above pressed down with a pressure greater than water at 50 feet depth. The air thickened lungs, straining for oxygen. They would have known to breathe shallow, to conserve the match flame, to stay still. They would have known not to panic when the roof began to sweat with condensation. The body learns the language of confinement. The German guns fired from beyond Brudzeinde Ridge, nearly 3 kilometers away. Their barrels glowed red crews, rotating to avoid collapse from heat. Smoke drifted east, curling into the same clouds that rained back down on the field. One artilleryman wrote in his letter home, "It is not war, it is work. We fire until the hands blister. The sound becomes our sleep." He never knew that 7 men beneath his target would outlast his barrage. Passchendaele had no front or rear, it was all exposure. Supply routes disappeared nightly. Mules drowned in the paths meant for men. The Royal Engineers laid planks over craters only to have them vanish by morning. The maps couldn't keep up, drawn at dawn, obsolete by dusk. Every square of the battlefield was rewritten hourly by rain and fire. In the aftermath of that barrage, aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance flights show nothing but gray. The texture of churned earth so uniform that no distinction between trench and crater remains. Historians later used these images to estimate density, roughly 3 shells per square meter. That meant in simple terms that every piece of ground large enough to stand on was struck 3 times. And yet, in that impossible equation, the dugout at D11 remained intact. Not untouched, but not erased. The roof had cracked, but not fallen. The timbers had bent, but not snapped. One survivor would later say, "The mud saved us. It took the blast before it reached the bone." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the same rain that doomed thousands became for 7 men the thin margin between death and breath. The rescue report filed 3 days later describes the moment they were found. The engineers heard rhythmic tapping, assumed water pump, realized it was Morse. They dug for 6 hours, reaching the air pocket by nightfall. The description is clinical: 7 survivors extracted, 2 semi-conscious, all hypothermic, no fatal injuries, no names were recorded. War didn't need names, only numbers. The German logs end differently. The battery's final note reads, "Sector D11 silenced completely." It was true in every measurable way. The ground had stopped moving. The coordinates were quiet. Silence to the gunners meant victory, but silence has its own kind of defiance. The 7 who rose from it carried no banner, no testimony. They were ghosts that refused appointment. They walked out under a sky still glowing from shell fire, covered in mud, eyes, vacant, voices gone. One was seen touching the beam of the dugout before leaving as if to thank it. Another stumbled into the cratered road and began laughing until he collapsed. In the weeks that followed, Passchendaele consumed thousands more. The ridge would change hands again and again until November. Each side measured success in yards gained or lost. But somewhere beneath all that calculation, beneath all that certainty, the story of the 7 remained unrecorded. A detail too small to fit into history's great machinery. And yet, the coordinates remain, the diary remains, the silence remains. Because sometimes, in the arithmetic of war, survival isn't measured in distance or glory, but in the faint tapping of 7 men under 6 feet of mud, defying everything the world had decided about them. Inside the dugout, time no longer moved in lines, it folded, shivered, and hung in the air like breath. The light had gone out hours ago. The flame died with a small hiss. then nothing. The dark was absolute, not black, but thick, wet, pressing against the eyes. They could hear it, the earth itself breathing around them, slow, uneven, alive. The 7 men waited in that silence, waiting not for rescue, but for the sound that would tell them they were still real. No one spoke for what felt like forever. The air was too heavy. It clung to the lungs, slow and damp, filled with the smell of oil, sweat, and the faint sweetness of decay. Somewhere behind them, water dripped from a crack in the wall, the rhythm steady like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. Every sound became enormous in the dark. The scrape of a boot, the shift of a shoulder, the faint rasp of fabric against timber. They began to listen to their own heartbeats, counting them like rations. Corporal Miles, the oldest of them, pressed his palm against the wall. The mud was warm. The vibration of distant shells came through it like thunder underwater. He whispered something no one answered. In the dark, they barely remembered each other's faces. They were only voices now, voices without bodies. The sergeant kept his words, simple orders that no longer mattered. "Hold on," he said. "Don't sleep." But his voice cracked on the last word. He didn't believe it himself. Private Allen tried to strike a match. The sulfur flared and died. The air was too thick. It left behind a thread of smoke that lingered for minutes. "There's no air left," he muttered. Someone else told him to stop talking. The noise wasted breath. Silence became survival. Every inhalation was a negotiation, a bargain with the mud. The youngest Collins, barely 20, began to hum. It was not a song anyone recognized, just a low sound rising and falling like the wind through broken wire. The others listened. For a moment, it almost sounded like home. Above them, the barrage rolled on. The earth shuddered. Mud fell from the ceiling in soft showers. One man covered his face with a sleeve already soaked through. Another started to cough, deep, tearing coughs that made his ribs creak. They could smell blood now, iron-sharp, unmistakable. Miles reached for his canteen, tipped the last of the water into the younger man's mouth. "Don't waste it," the sergeant whispered. But he didn't stop him. They both knew it didn't matter. The dugout groaned again, a deep, slow sigh from the timbers. The roof bowed. Someone prayed. Not in words, just in rhythm. The others joined in without meaning to, not a prayer, not a chant, just breathing together, sinking their lungs to the pattern of the shells above. It was all they could do. Outside the ridge was dissolving, every tree shredded, every trench erased. But inside this coffin of earth, 7 hearts kept time with the barrage. Hours passed, or maybe only one. It was impossible to know. Their watches had stopped. Time had melted into noise. The rain seeped through the walls, trickling over the hands pooling at their feet. The water was cold at first, then warm, too warm, carrying the heat of the detonations above. "Feels like the world's bleeding," someone said. No one laughed. The mud climbed higher, ankle, knee, waist, until they had to sit with legs drawn up, heads bent. The air thinned further. Their voices shrank. Words became whispers. Whispers became breaths. Private Henderson, the quiet one, the miner, began to knock on the wall with the butt of his rifle. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. He said it was habit, a way miners called out to prove they were still alive. At first the others told him to stop. The sound made them nervous, but after a while they waited for it. Every few minutes the knocks returned. A heartbeat made of sound. Proof. In the dark, small things became enormous. The drip of water sounded like rainstorms. The shift of a beam sounded like thunder. Their thoughts turned inward, slow and heavy. One remembered a street in Melbourne, the smell of bread before dawn. Another remembered the laughter of his sister on the day he left. Another thought of his dog waiting on the porch, perhaps still waiting. They told each other fragments not to comfort, but to stay awake. Memory became oxygen. When the mud reached their waists, panic came back. Collins shouted a raw, broken sound, clawing at the wall with his bare hands. "It's coming in," he said. "It's coming in." Miles grabbed him, pulled him down, forced him still. "Listen," he said. "Listen." They listened. The ground above was still shaking, but the rhythm had changed. Fewer shells now farther apart. The sound of rain was returning. The silence between detonations was longer. Hope, or its cruel twin. The sergeant told them to wait to count. 10 between each explosion, then 15, then 20. The guns were slowing. They could feel it, the tremor less constant, the thunder more distant. The air began to move again, just barely a slow draft creeping through the cracks. Someone began to cry. Someone else laughed, a sound half joy, half madness. "We made it," Collins whispered. But Miles said nothing. He had seen too many barrages pause before the final strike. They stayed that way for hours, unmoving, listening to the slow retreat of war. When the last shell fell, they didn't believe it. The silence felt wrong. Too deep. Too wide. They waited for the next blast. It never came. The only sound left was dripping water and the faint groan of the roof settling back into place. The sergeant lifted his head. Mud clung to his hair like wax. "If you can move," he said, "help me dig." They clawed upward with hands and helmets. The soil was soft but heavy. Every handful collapsed back into itself. They worked in turns, 2 digging, 5 resting. Air rushed through new cracks, thick, foul, but fresh enough to burn their lungs. They coughed until they tasted metal. They kept digging. The light was a memory above them, faint, unreachable, but it was there. At last, Henderson's hand broke through. Cold rain touched his skin. He laughed short, disbelieving, then fell back. The others pushed forward, widening the hole. A shaft of gray filtered in, painting their faces in ghostly streaks. They blinked eyes unadjusted to anything but dark. The first to climb out was Collins, his legs shaking, his uniform black from head to toe. He crawled onto the surface and stopped. The world was unrecognizable. The ridge was gone, only craters, smoke, and the faint hum of wind. The air smelled of fire and rain. The sky hung low and red, pulsing faintly with the glow of distant guns. The others emerged one by one, silent, blinking, breathing, as if learning how again. They stood there, 7 shadows, against a landscape that no longer had edges. Below them, the dugout collapsed, the roof finally giving way under the weight of soaked earth. It sank quietly, folding back into the ground, erasing the proof of their survival. Miles turned to watch it disappear. "It's gone," he said. The sergeant nodded. "So are we," he replied. No one argued. They walked without direction, stepping over craters and wreckage. Every few yards, a shape half buried, a rifle, a boot, a man. None of them spoke. They moved through it like ghosts who hadn't realized they were free. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady, washing their faces, tracing paths down the mud. In that sound, they heard something almost holy. Later, when rescuers found them, they didn't ask questions. The 7 just stood there, blank-eyed, silent, breathing the heavy air, as if unsure whether it was real. A medic asked how long they'd been trapped. None of them answered. Another asked how they'd survived. Miles finally spoke, his voice low, rasping. "We didn't," he said. Then he looked back at the ridge, still steaming under the rain, and smiled faintly. The mud did. The rain thickened. The smoke drifted. The ridge disappeared again into its own silence. And somewhere under that silence where 7 men had waited for the end, the heart of the earth kept beating. Slow, steady, alive. War has a way of counting, but never of remembering. For every 7 who crawled out of the earth at Passchendaele, there were thousands who vanished beneath it, dissolved into the same mud that saved those few. The official communiques spoke of progress of ground, gained of lines held, but the numbers hid more than they revealed. 9,000 shells for one patch of earth, 30 hours of bombardment, 7 men left breathing. That was not a victory. It was an equation written in blood and silence. On the German side, the battery crews had celebrated briefly. Reports came in clean. Sector D11 silenced. The gunners were professionals, efficient, disciplined men who measured success in precision and tonnage. They had fired 4 536 high-explosive rounds and 4 546 gas and shrapnel shells. Their rifles were cold only when barrels glowed red. They did not see faces. They did not hear screams. For them, the ridge was an invisible target, grid coordinates, distances, angles, nothing more. And yet, even in the German archives, there is a note, brief, almost human. A sergeant named Kruger wrote in his diary that the ridge refused to die. He said he could feel the resistance through the recoil of the gun, the ground shaking differently, as if fighting back. It was superstition, maybe, or the beginning of guilt. Across the lines, the British command had been issuing reports of stubborn defense under extreme conditions. Their telegrams to London were clean stripped of emotion, stripped of the smell and the sound. Behind the lines, officers walked through aid stations that looked like butcher stalls. The wounded came in waves carried on boards slick with blood and mud. Many had no visible wounds, just the hollow stare of concussion. They had survived, but something in them had not returned. By the end of October, the casualty figures at Passchendaele had crossed 240,000. Entire battalions reduced to numbers scribbled in margins. The landscape had consumed identity, no names, no faces, only the endless, anonymous churn of war. The ridge itself had become a thing alive, indifferent, eternal, feeding on both sides equally. One letter from a Canadian engineer described the field as a living swamp of death. He wrote, "The mud here remembers everything. It holds on to men the way the sea holds wrecks." He was right. The ground at Passchendaele was made of memory of bone, metal, and water. Even now, when rain falls there, it carries fragments upward, shards of helmets, boots, buttons. The land exhales its history. For the 7 who survived the war did not end with their rescue. They were transferred to Ypres for medical observation. Their lungs were damaged by fumes and pressure. Their skin was marked with burns from gas residue. For days they did not speak. When asked how long they'd been buried, none could answer. Their watches had stopped, their sense of time erased. Doctors wrote shell shock, traumatic mutism, functional paralysis. But those were just words to fill a column in a report. One of them, Henderson the miner, returned to the front 6 weeks later. He volunteered. He said the noise of the city made him uneasy. That silence in the dugout had become more real than the chatter of peace. He died in February, buried by another collapse. Another man, Collins, was sent home to Melbourne. He lived until 1953, never married, never spoke of the ridge. His neighbors called him the quiet one. When he died, they found a box under his bed. Inside was a piece of timber with a carved line of text, "The mud did." The German artillery units that shelled them were later destroyed near Cambrai. Their guns captured, their diaries scattered. One British soldier who found them wrote, "The pages were damp, names unreadable, but the coordinates were clear." He realized they had been firing at the same grid square for weeks, a square already erased from existence. It was not cruelty. It was habit. War becomes repetition until repetition becomes worship. The historians who came later tried to explain it, the survival, the coincidence, the math. Some said the mud absorbed the blast waves. Some said the dugout's angle deflected pressure. Others believed luck had nothing to do with it, that the shells had already done their killing elsewhere, and this was just the Earth's way of returning balance. Every theory sounded reasonable. Every theory missed the point. Because war is not logical, it's geological. It shapes the land the way rivers shape stone. What happened at Passchendaele was not strategy. It was weather, rain, gravity, pressure, chance. And yet even in that chaos, something human remained, 7 men pressed against the heart of the earth, refusing to vanish. In 1920, when the Commonwealth War Graves Commission returned to survey the ridge, they found the outlines of the old dugout under 6 feet of hardened clay. It had collapsed inward, sealing itself. The engineer who documented it wrote, "Structure appears to have been preserved by compression, like a fossil." He had no idea that men had lived there, that the air once carried their breath. He drew a neat rectangle on the map labeled Dugout Type B. Passchendaele was rebuilt over decades. Roads laid, farms restored, silence returned. But under that soil, the story lingered not in monuments or medals, but in the whispers of those who stood on the ridge at dusk. Locals still say the ground hums when it rains hard, that you can hear faint knocking if you listen long enough. Some call it myth, some call it memory. But every myth begins with something someone couldn't explain. In the archives of Ypres Museum, there's a single lantern on display, rusted its glass, warped the wick still blackened. The placard reads, "Recovered from a dugout, Passchendaele Ridge, 1917. No one can say for certain if it was theirs, but the curator says when he cleaned it, the smell of burnt oil and earth still clung to the metal. He left it that way. He said it seemed wrong to erase it. The Germans never expected any man to survive that bombardment. Their mathematics were sound, their calculations perfect. 9,000 shells should have meant extinction. But survival does not always obey numbers. Sometimes it obeys something quieter, smaller, more stubborn than logic, the will of a man who refuses to stop breathing, even when the world above has forgotten how. The dugout has long since caved in, absorbed by the mud that once protected it. But when the rain falls, the ground still moves. And if you press your ear close enough, they say you can still hear it. That faint rhythmic tapping, 3 beats, a pause, 3 more. The sound of life returning against all odds. The sound of men reminding the earth they are still here. And perhaps that was the real victory of Passchendaele, not the ridge, not the ground, not the territory marked on maps, but the whisper that defied silence. The proof that even in the deepest dark, under the weight of 9,000 shells, something human still dared to answer back. When the guns stopped, the silence did not arrive like mercy. It came crawling thick and heavy from every crater, every shattered trench, every smoking wound of the land. The ridge steamed under the rain, the air smelled of cordite and clay, and the sky hung low, motionless, like something exhausted. For a long time, no one moved. Men stood waist-deep in the same mud that had swallowed friends an hour before. The rescuers climbed the slope, shovels dragging boots, slipping breath, fogging in the chill. They were not searching for life anymore, only for proof that life had ever existed here at all. Then it came. A sound. Small, uncertain at first. A tap, then another, then 3 in rhythm. The men froze, heads tilted, listening. It came again. Steady, deliberate. Not echo, not wind, not illusion. Someone shouted below, and in that instant hope returned like a pain. They dug with spades until the handles snapped, then with bare hands when the mud closed around the blades. The rain thickened, The clay sucked at their knees, the world spun in exhaustion. And then the earth exhaled. A burst of foul air rose from a crack in the timber, warm, humid, heavy with breath. A hand appeared then, a face, eyes blinking, skin gray but alive. 7 men pulled one by one from the grave that refused to close. They carried them down the ridge stretchers, sliding ropes cutting into palms, the mud clutching at every step. The survivors barely moved, bodies limp, heads rolling with each jolt. Their uniforms were black, hardened by blood and soot, the smell of smoke clinging to their hair. One clutched a broken beam of timber, fingers locked unyielding. Another whispered the same phrase again and again. "It's still breathing. It's still breathing." The rescuers didn't ask what he meant. They only walked faster. Around them, the ridge hissed and groaned as if trying to reclaim what had been taken from it. That night, under a tent of torn canvas and flickering light, the world shrank to the sound of rain. The hospital behind Ypres glowed dim, and yellow lanterns swaying, water-dripping boots squelching across duckboards. The 7 lay side by side, blanketed, but still shivering, their faces, hollow eyes wide and unfocused. The nurses wiped the mud from their mouths, checked for breath, listened for pulse. The doctors wrote in ledgers, exhaustion, hypoxia, trauma. Cold words for something the human voice could not define. One nurse said later that when she leaned close, she could hear the echo of rain inside their lungs. By dawn, their names returned, faint, incomplete, written on tags tied to their wrists. Survivors, D11 sector. 2 words, that was all. Command signed the report, stamped it, sent it away. It would be lost among thousands of others. The ridge was quiet again, a silence so deep it felt like sleep. But somewhere beyond the lines, soldiers began whispering, the kind of whispers that travel faster than orders. The story of the 7 who outlived 9,000 shells. The men who slept in the belly of the earth and woke again. Some said the mud had saved them, others that it had marked them. And so the story spread from trench to trench, from fire to frost. Men repeated it between barrages, over cans of cold tea, through gasps in the dark. Each time the details changed, the number of shells, the hours underground. The words they spoke, but the rhythm stayed. The tapping. Always the tapping. They said you could hear it when the rain came, faint, far away underfoot. The sound of defiance buried beneath the mud. Officers called it superstition, told the men to forget, but they didn't. They listened harder. Because in that sound was proof. Proof that someone somewhere had survived what no one should. Weeks later, the ridge changed hands again. The craters deepened, the trenches vanished, and the world rearranged itself. When engineers came to rebuild the lines, they found the place again by accident, a patch of ground firmer than the rest. They tried to dig, but stopped after 2 feet. The soil there was different, denser, darker, compacted by heat and time. It didn't yield. It sounded solid. Unusually stable, the report said. No one questioned it. But locals swore that grass never grew right on that patch. The rain avoided it. And sometimes in certain weather, you could feel a vibration beneath your boots, as if something still moved down there. Years passed. The 7 scattered to the corners of the earth. Miles, the eldest, died in London lungs, failing, whispering, still counting to no one. Henderson, the miner, stayed in France, working the same tunnels he had once fought in. He was crushed in a collapse in 1919. They found a note in his pocket. "Tell them we heard the rain." Collins, the youngest, returned to Melbourne, lived by the docks, spoke to no one. His neighbors said he built a small shed in his yard, 6 feet deep, timber roof, where he'd sit during storms. They heard hammering inside, steady, rhythmic, as if rebuilding something the rest of the world had already buried. The other four disappeared from the record names, faded ranks, reassigned lives, dissolved into numbers. But the legend outlived them all. Every war needs a ghost story, something to whisper when the sky turns black. The men called it the dugout that waited. Some said the ridge itself kept them alive, others that it kept part of them. The myth became comfort, a promise that even the mud, even the earth, might spare a few. And when thunder rolled, soldiers leaned against the trench walls and listened. 3 taps, a pause. 3 more. It was enough. Decades later, 1932, the builders of the Passchendaele Memorial unearthed a lantern 6 feet down. The glass was cracked, the wick still blackened, the metal fused by heat. The curator at Ypres Museum cleaned it, but the smell of burnt oil and earth never faded. He left it that way. On the plaque, he wrote, "Recovered from Ridge D11, unknown unit." When storms pass over the town, visitors swear the lantern flickers once, a brief golden heartbeat in the glass. The staff say it's reflection, but none of them clean it during rain. By 1957, the ridge had softened again. Grass grew, cattle grazed, life returned. But for those who stood there long enough, the silence carried a pulse. A British officer visiting the memorial wrote in his diary, "The quiet hums after rain. It feels alive." He pressed a poppy into the soil and left. The wind moved across the fields, slow, deliberate, and in its breath there was something that wasn't wind at all. Just a faint rhythm, beneath the world, like the earth still remembering its own heartbeat. And now, a century later, the ridge stands calm. The fields shimmer green, the sky wide, the air clean. Tourists walk where trenches once ran, children play where shellfire once fell. But when the clouds gather, when the first drops hit the clay, the ground trembles, soft, patient, ancient. Farmers stop their plows and listen. The old men nod, the young ones laugh. But if you kneel close, ear to the soil, you'll hear it faint, steady, enduring. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. The same sound that called rescuers through the storm. The same rhythm that kept 7 men alive. 9,000 shells, 6 feet of earth. 7 breaths that refused to stop. The math will never make sense. But maybe it doesn't have to. Because sometimes the loudest sound in war is survival itself. The rain never really leaves Passchendaele. It just waits above the clouds, gathering, remembering. Each drop that falls carries the taste of old iron, old sorrow, old breath. The fields are green now, soft, endless, gentle, but beneath that green lies another color entirely, darker, deeper, truer. It is the color of memory, the color of 9,000 shells and the 7 who refused to die. At dawn, mist drifts low across the ridge, soft, patient, moving like the ghosts of smoke that once burned here. The farmers begin their work. The same steps, the same motions, the same silence. They plow the earth without speaking, because everyone knows this soil is different. Every year, they find something, a belt buckle, a rusted bayonet, a piece of bone the rain has lifted from its long sleep. They set it aside quietly in a box by the fence. No one throws it away. They just nod and keep walking. The land still feeds them, even if it remembers every drop of what it was fed. In the evenings, the air cools, the mist thickens, the ridge hums softly under the weight of twilight. People say that's the wind in the grass, but if you stand still enough, if you breathe slow, it isn't the wind. It's lower, it's slower. It comes from the ground itself. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more, the rhythm of the ridge, the sound that has never left. Old men call it nonsense. Children whisper that it's the seven still counting the shells. But those who fought here or descended from those who did, they just listen and don't speak. Some things don't need explaining. War leaves monuments, but memory leaves echoes. The stone markers at Tyne Cot rise sharp against the horizon, row after row, name after name, but not every name has a story, and not every story has a name. Somewhere among those white slabs is the space for the seven who never asked to be remembered. They left no medals, no citations, no words, only the sound of their breath against the earth that tried to bury it. It's enough. History calls them anonymous, but the mud, the rain, the silence, they remember differently. There are days when the horizon feels the same as it must have then, low clouds, air heavy with water, wind curling through the grass. On those days, the farmers stop their plows a little sooner. Tourists pause at the memorial wall a little longer, and the ridge seems to breathe again. A tremor, subtle but real. The sound of something turning over deep beneath the roots. The earth remembering that once, just once, it chose mercy over hunger. In archives across Europe, the records still exist, lines of faded ink that smell faintly of smoke and mildew. The German logbook reads Sector D11 silenced. The Australian report reads 7 survivors recovered. And between those two sentences lies everything the war could not understand, that sometimes silence is not death, it is endurance. That sometimes numbers can be wrong, and the impossible can still be true. The clerks who wrote those words are gone now. Their pens dried their files, boxed their wars, replaced by others. But the ridge still holds the evidence beneath every blade of grass, beneath every rainfall, beneath every heartbeat that dares to listen. Years after the war, an old nurse who once treated the 7 wrote a single line in her journal. They breathed differently, as if their lungs had learned the rhythm of the rain. She never forgot the look in their eyes. Not fear, not relief, something quieter. A knowing. The kind of knowing that never speaks because it no longer needs to. She died in 1951, her notes buried in a drawer, rediscovered decades later. The ink had bled with time, but the words were still there, still legible, still alive. Every few years, storms roll across Flanders, black skies, low thunder wind sweeping from the channel. And each time the ridge answers. The soil shakes softly. The air trembles in its bones. It's not superstition. It's resonance. The physics of remembrance. The ground vibrating in harmony with everything that was lost and everything that somehow survived. The locals don't look up when it happens. They don't run. They just nod as if greeting something ancient and familiar. A historian once stood here at dusk, tape recorder in hand, rain slicking his hair to his face. He played the sound back later, expecting only wind. But somewhere under it, faint, distant, steady, there was a pattern, a rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, 3 more. When he played it to others, some laughed, some shivered, some said it was mechanical interference. But he returned every year on the same date, and every year when the rain came, the rhythm came too. He never published it. He said it didn't belong on paper. Now, a century later, tourists walk the ridge with cameras and umbrellas tracing paths once drawn in fire. They take photos of the memorials, the trenches, the endless sky. But what they don't see is the layer beneath the heartbeat still pulsing under their feet. Every step presses lightly against the same mud that once sealed those 7 inside. Every step is an echo, the living walking atop the breathing memory of the dead. That's how war ends, not in victory, not in defeat, but in absorption. The land takes it back. There is a saying among the farmers here, simple, half-remembered. When the rain knocks, you listen. No one recalls where it came from, but on nights when the storms are strong enough to make the windows shake, they tell their children to stop talking, to stop the radio, to listen closely. The rain hits the roof, the wind rattles the glass, and somewhere beneath it, faint but real, the earth knocks back. They never call it haunting. They call it remembering. The museums nearby are full of objects, helmets, buttons, bent rifles, melted bullets. But no artifact carries the same weight as silence, because silence here is not absence. It's memory turned inside out. Every sound the war ever made still lingers, stretched thin, under decades of grass and peace. If you stand long enough, if you close your eyes, the distance between then and now disappears. You can feel the weight of the rain, smell the gunpowder, taste the soil, and then, just for a heartbeat, you can hear it again. The rhythm, the life that refused to die. 9,000 shells, 6 feet of earth, 7 men. The math of survival still defies reason. The scientists say it was pressure and density. The historians say it was luck. The soldiers say it was the mud. But perhaps it was something else, something older, simpler, more human. The will to keep breathing when the world says stop. The heartbeat that belongs to no nation, no army, no flag. Just the earth and those who trusted it enough to stay. When night falls, the ridge disappears, only the wind remains. But under that wind, under that quiet hum of insects and water and soil, the story continues, not in words, not in books, but in pulse. It moves through the roots, through the stones, through the bones buried deep beneath. The land still remembers the shape of their bodies, the sound of their lungs, and maybe in its own way it still keeps count. So when the rain begins again, as it always does, remember this place. Remember the 7 who slept beneath 9,000 shells and woke to tell the silence what it sounded like. Because some stories are not meant to be told, only heard. And if you listen long enough, really listen, you'll realize it's still there. The rhythm, the echo, the heartbeat beneath the world.